Yes, we're live. This is Adam Carroll from Justice for All, Burma Task Force. We're here today with our dear colleague, Deborah Stothard, describing her work of almost 40 years as a trainer and mentor to a generation of activists, especially women from Burma. Her work is focused on business and human rights, atrocity prevention, and women's leadership. In 1996, she founded Alcian Burma, which spearheaded a range of innovative and empowering human rights programs. This includes how do you pronounce it? Alcian?
Yep, Alcian.
Alcian's ongoing intensive leadership program for diverse young women from Burma for the past 22 years. Debbie has either facilitated or been a resource person at nearly 300 training events in the past 15 years. Most of these were grassroots-oriented workshops delivered in the field, focused on human rights advocacy, economic literacy, and business and human rights, as well as transitional justice and atrocity prevention. In the news this week, the Burmese parliament has just voted to spend $500,000 US defending Burma's genocide in its ongoing responses to the International Court of Justice. At least someone is profiting here, while the military continues its escalations in Rakhine State and its provocations in Kachin and Shan states. We'll ask today what patterns we have seen in Burmese military and government abuses, and what trends in civil society activist response have been developing in Burma and throughout the ASEAN region up through the present unfortunate moment of COVID-19 crisis. So, Debbie, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, you're speaking from your office in Bangkok.
Yep.
Yep, and it's 9 p.m. there. Okay.
Well, thanks for not insisting that I stay up till 2 a.m. to align with your time in New York.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We're happy to do it now. You've been very active and throughout the ASEAN region, giving all these trainings. You started out though as a crime reporter. Where was that?
I started out as a teenage crime reporter at a national English daily called The Star in Malaysia back in 1981. And I think I'm really glad that I started out in crime, because it helped me understand quite a few things that we can't accept that all institutions are monolithic, that the best criminal mind is not one who uses force, but one who understands loopholes in the system. And that helped me be a little innovative and naughty, especially in my early human rights career, to get things done where people weren't expecting me to be.
Yeah. Well, in working in Burma over this period, I mean, it really takes a whole range of skills and alternative and non-official skills sometimes to build those relationships in the grassroots, to get past authorities. Have authorities in any of the countries you've worked in ever harassed you?
Oh, yes. Harassment is quite normal. In fact, if the authorities aren't harassing you in one way or another, you sometimes wonder whether you're being effective. In ASEAN region, for example, at least one government has to be angry with you at any given time. If not, you're not doing a good job. In 2018, I was actually declared a threat to national security and deported from Vietnam. And for 13 years, I was a threat to national security in Burma, Myanmar, and banned. So, it's a girl thing, being dangerous in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Well, it's not just a year of living dangerously, but it's a whole career. And of course, that complicates matters because it affects your relationships with others. Many of whom may also be under a cloud of surveillance or harassment. So how do they navigate that?
I think firstly, I went into this understanding that I was privileged because I actually had a passport, I could travel safely, and I had family support and a reasonable network of friends who would help me if I got into trouble. And I was used to negotiating with the authorities. I used to hang out with the cops and the fire brigade and the emergency services when I was a crime reporter. So I understood a little bit about how they thought. So when we're doing this thing, and if I'm invited to go to some place that I shouldn't be in, I would actually ask the host community or the organization, have you done a risk assessment? And what should I do? In fact, sometimes what should I not wear or not say in order to make sure we get the workshop done safely for participants? Because if we were sneaking around, the people who would be most in danger are the grassroots activists, not me. So I have to take my cues from those who are most in danger. For me, the worst thing that could happen, I reckon, would be detention, deportation, maybe a bit of being, pushed around or assaulted. But I would not be in that situation where I was likely to be enforced disappeared or where nobody would be looking for me. So I think that helped a lot. And I think also being an Asian woman, particularly as one gets older, people don't look at you twice. You look like someone's auntie. So they're looking for some Lucy Liu in black leather when they think of some dangerous human rights activist, threat to national security. They don't think that the threat to national security looks like your next door auntie. So I've been fine.
Yeah, well, all right. Watch out for those aunties. But last year, I think, unless it was 2018, I remember the news was going around. Oh, Debbie has been detained in an airport. Was
Oh,
that
that was
related
in
to?
Vietnam. It was
That
in
was
Vietnam.
Vietnam, right?
Ironically, I was invited as a guest of the World Economic Forum to speak
Mm.
at an ASEAN conference of the World Economic Forum,
Huh.
and I was declared a threat to national security, detained at the airport, and deported.
Oh.
It was kind of interesting. Back in 1996, I was very honored and privileged to be one of the co-organizers of the Asia Pacific Conference on East Timor. It was a peace conference on Timor-Leste in Kuala Lumpur, and over 100 of us were beaten up and arrested by a government-sponsored mob to stop the conference from going ahead. And I've been lucky because every time I've been detained or harassed, I've enjoyed solidarity and support from other people. And most of the time, I haven't felt alone. So I think, solidarity is a two-way process. I don't think we give solidarity and think that we're giving. We are also receiving solidarity, and that's really important.
Mm.
Um, we are never in a dangerous position as the Rohingya are, who are stateless, who are subjected to all kinds of violence, not just from not just from Burmese nationalists or the Burmese army, but pretty much everywhere they go, they are vulnerable of being exploited and persecuted, even in Malaysia now. So, the danger that I or my colleagues face is nothing compared to that utter powerlessness that the Rohingya have been subjected to.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to ask about how you founded Alcian Burma, and what drew you originally to Burma and to human rights work in Burma.
Okay, going back to school days,
Yeah.
we studied geography of Southeast Asia, which is part of our school curriculum when I was a teenager. And, I would always be on the lookout for people from neighboring countries. But it wasn't until um, uh, it wasn't until I was in my late teens, when I was a crime reporter, that I actually met a Burmese who was serving on a ship at the port near where I worked. So, as part during the story, someone said, "Hey, you've been asking around for Burmese. We have a Burmese engineer on our ship." And I said, "Oh yeah, I'd like to meet him." And he was surprised. I said, "Well, you're the first Burmese I've met, and we're practically neighbors." And no one I knew had ever been to Burma at that point. Everyone had been to Singapore and Indonesia and Philippines and Thailand, but never been to Burma, because Burma was a very closed country in the 70s and 80s. So if the news popped up about Burma, I was always, "Oh, what's going on there?" But going forward, after I was a crime reporter, I actually went back to school and studied. I moved to Sydney and studied communications at a local university, and got involved in human rights activism. Mainly because the collective I was with needed a woman, and no right-minded, no sane human female from Asia would join that collective except me. And then, because I'd been in the media, I'd be scolding them and saying, "This is not how you write a press release," etc., etc. But basically, what we did was work across various campuses in Sydney, different universities campuses, and between all of us, we were able to get resources to run campaigns. So in those days, we referred to countries in the South as third world, and if there was a flare-up, a crisis of any sort in a particular country in the region, we would go and look for students from that country and say, "Hey, we're here, we'll run an instant campaign for you." What was ironic was we did it with Chinese students on Tiananmen. We worked in solidarity with Timor-Leste activists over the Dili massacre, during which one of our colleagues was killed in the Dili massacre, on the Malaysian human rights crackdown, Singapore human rights crackdown, the crackdowns in Indonesia and Philippines and Thailand and so on. But when 8888 happened, the big national uprising in Burma, we couldn't find Burmese students. We found migrants, people and exiles who had fled the earlier uprisings in the 70s. And so that's where we started to engage with Burma. And of course, eventually I became more part of the Burmese community than the Malaysian community. And then there was no way out. I was hooked on Burma. And here I am, 32 years later.
Well, being banned doesn't seem to have affected that relationship too much. In fact, maybe it spurred you on to go deeper. Your many colleagues in Burma, especially the women's groups, how have you been working to assist them in capacity building or whatever needs they might have?
When we set up the office here in 1996, there were quite a few Burmese or ethnic organizations based in Bangkok, but most of them were dominated or run by men. And the women in those offices were probably the daughters or the wives of the leaders in that office. And it seems so ironic, because I knew of many women who had been involved in the movement. And of course, we also had Aung San Suu Kyi at the helm of the movement. And we said, "Where are all these women?" And we found them on the border. And we said, "Okay, we will make sure there is a space in our office for you." And many of the women, there were only a very small handful of women leaders who were interested in human rights or politics. And they said, "Well, we have a lot of young members, but we can't train them up, or we don't have time to." So, "Okay, send them to us. We'll do an internship with them." But that eventually became a much more comprehensive, structured training. So we've been running this program for 22 years. And engaged with 30 over women's organizations or the women's wing of other general organizations. And it's been really exciting to see that many women who have been taking a stand against impunity and discrimination in the country, who have been talking about genuine peace and have been committed to working across ethnic boundaries, have been trained by us. So that's exciting. It's we've seen women take a stand where their male counterparts wouldn't when it comes to atrocity crimes against ethnic and religious minorities in the country. So there are currently 2 members of our board who are alumni. In fact, currently the chair of our board is an alumni of the women's program. And that's why sometimes I have to remind my colleagues that we have to be tough when we train these women who are living and studying and working with us, because they're going to be our future bosses. If we spoil them too much and we don't encourage them to be accountable for themselves, we're going to have a nightmare when they become our bosses.
Well, I had heard somewhere that in Burma, most of the upcoming lawyers are women, because the profession had been so impeded during the dictatorship years that only women would take that risk to put their careers in law. And but I don't know if that will change. Of course, it probably will. But civil society in Burma must be fascinating, given all the constraints and all the resilience of the people. As far as building solidarity among ethnic communities, what changes have you seen over time? Any changes?
Yes, I think we've seen some of the leaders become more open-minded, especially the younger generation, and also the women have become more open-minded, because a lot of the women activists start to recognize that ethnicity and religion is not the only way they're discriminated against. They are also discriminated against or excluded because they are women, and they start to see that. So I think it's very exciting and very inspiring to see that sometimes the ones who take the strongest risks, the highest risks in activism are actually young women. I remember about 12 years ago, one of our alumni disappeared after being trained with us, and we were wondering what happened to her. And then later on, we found out that she was an undercover environmental rights investigator in northern Burma. And all these amazing reports about how human rights and the environment were being violated by military-linked businesses was starting to come out, and we realized that and stories of how development projects were grabbing land from local people. Some of these stories came out into the international community because of her work. So, that's the exciting part, that we have invested for over 20 years in training young women to become leaders and pushing them sometimes far harder than they would have liked to be pushed. And then later on, they become our colleagues and our bosses and our board members. And they in turn inspire us by their work and by the way they stick to their principles on a day-to-day basis, not just in their political activism, but also in their personal lives.
Yeah. No, that what you say reminds me of a domestic violence organization that I used to be involved with here, that assists Muslim women in New York City. And it was founded a number of years ago by a friend, Rabina Niaz, to empower women not just in their moments of crisis, but to involve their family, involve their community in taking back their, their capacity to make decisions in their lives. And so she's really, Rabina has really been able to build women's leadership throughout, the last 10 years or more. And so it reminds me of what you're saying, that we're really investing in the future, not to sound like a capitalist. It's also just the best way to work is to build these relationships. Though whether it's Burmese women like YY Nu or Sharifa, Shakira, who was on our show not long ago, uh, or many others who can't even be named because, as you say, they're in very sensitive positions, gathering information in the field and can't be known. So it's a privilege to work with these activists. By the way, we seem to have a strange echo. I don't know if there's anything outside your window.
We've just had a rainstorm here in Bangkok, and what you're hearing in the background are bullfrogs.
Really? Well,
yes.
Then that puts a whole different meaning to it. I'm glad it's not something technological.
I was wondering if you're going to hear that, but I don't think I'm going to be able to actually walk out the front door and yell at the bullfrogs to hush. So we're going to have to put up with that.
Some things you do have to live with, yeah.
Oh, it's nature. What do you expect?
Yeah. Well, I suppose they would approve of the environmental activist. But as far as the many needs in Burma, those don't go away with opening the markets or whatever game that the Burmese government is playing at the moment. What are your thoughts? I mean, you mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi as leader of the democracy movement, which she was. And besides the overwhelming disappointment in her moral leadership, how would you reflect on that that sort of change?
I think, it's really hard to be able to work out what happened with Aung San Suu Kyi, and I don't think I'd like to speculate, but I want to say that there was a time when she stuck to her principles, and she was basically told by all around her, including the international community, that she needed to be able to compromise and work out what she needed to be able to compromise and get along with the military. And I can remember that time that all of us were saying that we needed to consider how going after the elections, engaging in the electoral process that was evidently unfair and without addressing constitutional reform was going to help Burma. And everyone kept saying, forget about the constitution, let's have a parliament first and work it from there. And essentially, the constitution has perpetuated the situation where we actually don't have the ability to address what's going on. So I really worry. I'm really concerned, and I really worry about what this all means in terms of where we're going on Burma, but also the fact that the fundamental principles there's been no commitment to fundamental principles of equality, inclusion, and human rights and democracy amongst the international stakeholders and funders, let alone the key political groups in the country. We haven't seen a fundamental shift in the military. What we've seen is behavior modification, changing from uniform to parliament without actually changing the rules of the game, without actually trying to address impunity and military corruption.
Right. Well, that is very disturbing. And yet, do you find that young people in Burma are unwilling to accept this as the way things are?
I think some young people are taking a huge risk and trying to make a stand on this and being quite clear about where they the kind of future Burma that they want. And many of the people have actually young people who've taken a stand have been harassed, threatened, and even charged under the communications laws of Burma. So instead of being jailed, being sentenced to 100 years jail, as we used to see in the past, we're seeing young activists being charged with 20 charges, and all carrying 1 or 2 year sentences. So it's death by a million cuts. But going back to the fundamentals of Burma, a lot of people don't realize that the military budget for 2019 to 2020 is 280% of the 2011 budget, when the country officially moved from a military dictatorship to a parliamentary democracy or a controlled democracy. So the transition has actually benefited the military hugely, because their budget rose from 1.2 trillion kyat to 3.37 trillion kyat. So yeah, it's nearly 3 times the budget of what they had 8 years before. At the same time, we've seen a rise in land grabs, especially around places that are important, significant in terms of business, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of natural resources. So a lot of the violence in Rakhine State that targeted the Rohingya were also ensuring that land that was economically important was being cleared and grabbed for free by military-linked companies, the government, and crony companies. And when we look, I mean, sometimes I encourage, in our trainings, we encourage young people and participants to follow the money and to look at the economic impact on the country. For example, when the spike in genocidal violence took place in 2017, a lot of people don't realize that the Burmese economy subsequently lost more than $3 billion in new foreign direct investment.
And how have they made up for that?
This is the thing. If we look at, basically, new foreign direct investment dropped by nearly 68% within a year. That was about nearly $3 billion, and that would have paid for nearly 4 years of national health budget. That's how much they lost from their economy within 1 year following the rise in genocidal violence in 2017, which led to nearly 1 million Rohingya fleeing the country, and which led to this court case at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So and this happened at a time that new foreign direct investment for other ASEAN countries rose. So it wasn't a regional trend, it was just a Myanmar-Burma trend. And now with the impact of COVID, with the impact of the global financial crisis, the Burmese economy is in trouble. And if they wanted to attract investors, and if they wanted to attract sustainable investment, they're going to have to think quite seriously about changing the situation. If they keep up the hate speech, if they keep up inciting violence, we've now seen the Tatmadaw enjoying so much impunity that after attacking the Rohingya and driving the majority out of the country, they attacked the Rakhine Buddhists. We've seen in the past, in less than 4 months, between January and May this year, over 400 military attacks, either targeting civilians or affecting civilians, not just in Rakhine State, but also in Chin, Shan, Karen, Sagaing, Karenni, and Mandalay states and regions. So we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states and regions in the west, in the north, and in the east, and the south, and the southeast of the country. We had 410 armed attacks or military attacks or clashes that resulted in thousands of displaced people and 134 civilian deaths. So we need to understand that what was inflicted on the Rohingya to a lesser extent is being inflicted on other ethnic minorities in the country. And we need to address the root cause of the genocide and of this ongoing violence, which is military impunity and ultra-nationalism.
I think, as you said, impunity has been ongoing and extreme, and it's supported by the lack of accountability in finances. The military-owned businesses support the military. The military doesn't depend on the civilian government for its budget. It's a law unto itself. And this is a huge problem. And of course, then there's constitutional issues and, keep it running certain ministries and keep it in power, basically. So it is a difficult situation, a power sharing situation for Aung San Suu Kyi. And yet we haven't seen any campaigns to erode that impunity in a meaningful way, or to hold perpetrators accountable in a sustained way.
Look, the thing is, the military, many people join the military not to kill people. They join the military to make money. And then killing people is part of the process of making money. So we need to hit them where it hurts, not by sending peacekeepers or commandos or Rambos into the country to attack the Tatmadaw, but actually cutting off their sources of income, including off-book income, extra budget income. For example, the Myanmar Economic Corporation, the Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings, these known in the country as UPINE are notorious and hated companies because these companies were owned by the military, run by the military, and the military profited these companies by grabbing land from people with impunity. So I think we need to start sanctioning these companies and make it unprofitable. We might have to literally make genocide unprofitable. We got to make atrocity crimes unprofitable in the country. And that's how the international community can do that. Trying to engage and reason is not going to work. This is not how the military thinks. They respect organizations and people. They might not like it, but they respect you when you dare to use your power to put your foot down. In fact, what we've seen in the history of this regime is that the big changes have happened in Burma because of threats of sanctions.
Well,
So,
bringing with that, maybe to speak a bit more about sanctions, there are some small sanctions here and there on particular military leaders, better than nothing, but not as extensive as they could be in the EU countries or even in the US or Canada. And as far as ASEAN or China or other countries in the region, I don't see any of the Asian countries have any sanctions or any kind of control on doing business with military companies. Some of our allies, like Simon Billenness and others, the Global Justice Center people, others are working this angle of corporate accountability and demanding that Kirin Beer, for example, not do business with military-owned banks or other groups. So this is a very important part of the work we're doing, and to end the complicity. But it's quite an iceberg because there's always in the dark these holding companies and these other investors who are profiting off terrible suffering and oppression.
I think we need to understand that consumer boycotts are incredibly important, but they need to be backed up by government sanctions and government policies. And this is where things worked in 2003 and 2004, when the US imposed a ban on imports from Burma and a ban on financial transactions. The rest of ASEAN had to fall in line because ASEAN were using they were using the Burmese supply chains and using stuff from Burma in their exports to the US and to Europe, which are their main markets. So what we need to do is understand supply chains. And if you look at what's been happening with the customs and border protection policies and rates or bans on goods made from Uyghur slave labor in Xinjiang, that has really changed and shaken things up in contemporary times. And I think we do need to understand that economic sanctions may hurt us when we impose on on a perpetrator. In the short term, it hurts us, but in the long term, it saves not just the people who've been oppressed, but our own movements and our own economies.
With some situations like South Africa are well known as success stories for sanctions and for boycotts. Others, Israel, Palestine, are more contentious. Others seem to be held up as warnings or failures, like sanctions on Iraq at one point, or currently there's sanctions on Iran, which are arguably needed, but it is a time of a pandemic. So there are humanitarian questions that come in about all these. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that every situation is different. and that sanctions shouldn't be thrown out with the bathwater. That we need to keep that as tools, and they need to be robust sanctions without loopholes.
I think we need to definitely target military-owned companies and companies that either partially owned or fully owned by military leaders and former military leaders. That's very clear.
Mm.
And if we look at the regime of counterterrorism, of halting human trafficking and child sexual exploitation, then we can see there are so many tools in the toolbox when it comes to sanctioning and punishing individuals and the companies they are linked to for being involved in serious crimes and atrocity crimes. So that's important. But equally important is also looking at countries in the region who have been abusing and exploiting the labor, the human rights of survivors of atrocity crimes in Burma, including Rohingya migrants and asylum seekers.
Mm.
That's what happened in Malaysia.
Mm.
In
It's
fact, it's so bad that last week, 5 UN special rapporteurs and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued a joint statement to call on Malaysia to stop persecuting migrants and asylum seekers under the guise of a COVID-19 control response.
There seemed to have been an orchestrated campaign on social media in Malaysia, vilifying the Rohingya refugees as somehow a threat, the same way that many immigrant groups can be. And this poisonous rhetoric seemed to have led to a real policy change on the part of Malaysia to restrict movement for many of the Rohingya. And now I understand that there's restrictions on NGOs as well.
Well, what we've seen in the crackdown during the month of May, which started during Ramadan and continued through Eid, is that up to we're talking about more than 2,000 people probably detained, and a lot of them are actually Rohingya or other survivors of atrocity crimes in Burma. Children as young as 4 years old, elderly people were also rounded up in this crackdown and then pushed into crowded immigration detention centers, apparently to stop the spread of COVID from these criminalized migrants and refugees into the broader population. But by crowding them under such conditions, we've already started to see that there's been a spike in COVID-19 infections in these detention centers, and we're essentially putting Rohingya people who have either fled atrocity crimes or whose family members have been subjected to genocidal violence in Burma, we're actually persecuting them with almost the same amount of violence and hatred as they were subjected to in Burma. And that's really horrific because if you look at the International Court of Justice provisional measures on Burma, it's to protect the people, the Rohingya people, from being subjected to acts of genocide, including depriving them of the means of survival, and to also halt incitement and hate speech for violence against the Rohingya. And we are seeing some of that happening here in Malaysia, which is really horrific given that Malaysia was a supporter of the Rohingya. Malaysia supported the fact-finding mission on Myanmar, and then there's been this massive turnaround. It's also been a domestic political agenda because the current government who came into power recently has been um, laughed at and vilified for very poor decisions they made. And they've been, some of the ruling party have been, and also even ministers have been implicated in justifying this hate speech because they see it as a way of blaming the previous government.
It's so shocking and yet maybe not surprising at the same time that this divisive political game affects the most vulnerable communities. It's like a predatory thing where whether it's people of color or poor people impacted by lockdowns. I mean, the coronavirus crisis will continue for quite some time, and this impact will deepen. And on top of that, blaming already traumatized people, what effect will that have on them and on their children? So I used to think that Malaysia was the one ASEAN country that offered a positive example. And now it's hard to know what to expect from the future. But with the Rohingya, again, going back to the root causes, the military that must be reformed, that must be reined in, the Tatmadaw mafias, all of that, it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of partnership with Burmese groups, diverse groups, solidarity among the ethnic communities, empowerment of women, but also, as you mentioned earlier, the international community, the US, other groups have not always used their leadership effectively. And right now we're considering a new ambassador, US ambassador to Burma. Over the next few weeks, he'll have to answer questions. If you were to have him here, what questions would you ask him?
Before you promote economic ties, investments and imports with Burma, with the Burma of today, you need to ensure that you are not profiting financially, economically, politically, or socially the perpetrators of a genocide. If you don't care about the people of Burma and the human rights violations that the men, women, and children are facing on a day-to-day basis, then at least cover your ass. Don't side with the perpetrators of a genocide, and don't side with the apologists of a genocide. Side with the people.
And that's a great note to go off on. And I think that, NGOs, human rights groups, we need to be heard by the World Bank. We need to be heard by all those other sectors that have so much power and so much influence that they don't use. And you mentioned the Uyghur struggle and the effort to hold some companies accountable in being complicit in slave labor and oppression. So that needs to happen here in Burma and many other places. So just any last thoughts for NGO community, for human rights campaigners everywhere, building a larger human rights movement?
I think I'm privileged to be part of a global community of solidarity. And I want to make sure that this community of solidarity continues to grow and include more and more diverse people and young people. Solidarity is a two-way process. We grow from offering solidarity and receiving solidarity. And that solidarity is based on the principle of equality. I never expected to spend 30 years of my life working for human rights in Burma, but I've learned so much and grown so much from it. And I can say it can be stressful, but at least it's never boring.
Well, watch out, you get what you wish for. Yeah. No, we're really glad that we have you on the show, but also have you in this movement. It's really important. And if, I'm looking forward to working with you. We're probably going to end the show in a moment. I just gave the message to our producer, and hopefully he's still there. But I think, yeah, justice for all. We do what we can. Now we're working on India as well as the Uyghur, as well as Burma. And there's so many parts, and we're stretched, and we're stressed by the virus, by the financial impact of the virus on our community. So we need support, and I'm sure that's going to be true for so many NGOs just to get through the next couple of years. Thank God for volunteers. That's how you start out, and maybe that's how you end up. But it's all about how you wish to help the world. So,
well, young people ask me what course I did to get to where I was, and I said I was a volunteer for 10 years.
Yeah. So there's
and I'm glad I'm working with you. I'm glad that all of us are in this movement together, and I'm glad that we can see beyond a particular geographical cause and look at how we support people, whether it's Rohingya from Burma, migrants from all around the world, the Uyghur in Xinjiang, people in Kashmir, wherever they are, people in Yemen and Syria and Palestine, wherever they are.
Yep. Well, thank you, Debbie. All right, looking forward to working together. Yeah.
Okay. Stay strong.